Well, hey, friends, welcome to another podcast episode of Mike's podcast. It's good to have you with us today. Hey, I wanted to give a little quick intro here before we get into today's interview, which I am so excited about. I just re-listened to the whole thing, and I think I'm going to be listening to this one multiple times over because our guest today, Jason Miller, pastor at South Bend City Church, is one of my favorite people. He's so thoughtful and interesting, and the work that he's doing, I'm so compelled by. And I think if I know you from the people who have interacted with me to let me know that you're listening to this and have shared thoughts and ideas and questions with me, I think you are going to really appreciate and resonate with him as well. And a part of why I wanted to do a little intro here is some of you I have known from like previous things, work that I've done, and even like church that I was leading, and I often get asked by people like, "Hey, what are you doing now?" And honestly, in some ways, it's been a hard question to answer because there are like 47 different things that I'm engaged in doing right now. But one of the consistent things I've tried to share with people is I said, like, hey, one of the things I'm doing is I feel called in this season to engage and help the Post Evangelical Church and work that's happening there, and really specifically feel called to help create connection amongst the Post Evangelical Church, to help catalyze the movement that I see happening there, and to help find ways to resource what is happening there, which then leads to the question oftentimes of like, well, what is the Post Evangelical Church? So I recently had David Gushee on a few episodes ago, if you haven't listened to that, and he, as an academic, starts talking about what's sort of happening in the post-evangelical movement and sort of his vantage point of it. But I wanted to offer a few other like case studies in different ways. So I'm gonna, over the next maybe like monthish, I'm gonna have some friends on here who are going to help us to understand it from some different vantage points. And so today, Jason is on here because he's leading a church that I think really shows a bit of what the post evangelical church is like, what's going on there, and what's happening there. And I'm really excited for you all to get to hear it and to get a bit more of a picture of what's going on in the post evangelical church. And I think some of you will be really inspired and intrigued by it. So let's jump over to that interview. All right. Well, friends, welcome back to Mike's podcast. It is good to have you with us. And I am super stoked to have my good friend Jason Miller with us today. And Jason planted a church a few years ago called South Bend City Church. And friends, I got to tell you, I love what's happening there. In fact, when I left the church that I had been a part of for 19 years, I told Jason here, I said, like, you're going to be my pastor in this season. And I've been regularly engaging with his teaching, connected with a few other members of the community of the church out there. I've gone out there a few times, and for lack of a better term, I think the space that South Bend City Church sort of fits in the larger, broader church landscape is being described as post evangelical, which I think is not our favorite term, but seems to be maybe the best one that's being used right now. And Jason, I wanted to have you on because as I've been sharing with people, I'm doing some work with churches in the post evangelical space and trying to build some things in that space. People keep asking, like, well, what is that? And so I wanted to have you on to maybe help fill in that picture a little bit for us. So I've done a whole bunch of talking here right at the get go, but I thought maybe we could start by you just sharing a little bit of your story and the story of your church and how and why you started it and kind of where all that kind of came from.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Mike. I'm really pumped, and we love Mike Goldsworthy in South Bend. Um, I'm a church kid, born and raised. Family always had a real passion for church, and that was always actually Midwest versions of like Churches of Christ and Christian churches. I remember we moved a lot growing up, and we would always have to find a new church when we moved. And church mattered because it wasn't just what we did on Sunday; it was where we volunteered, and it shaped our social circles and all this stuff. So as a kid, I remember asking my parents, how do we pick a church?
Hmm.
And like I'll never forget early that the thing that they said that rang loud was, well, we look for like the Bible belief, like the Bible is our guide, and so the Bible, we look for a church that teaches the Bible and trusts the Bible. So, like, I'm pretty young. I'm like, man, this book matters, apparently. Not just because, whatever God said or whatever, but specifically our family is making a bunch of decisions that are going to shape our social reality and all this stuff. So, like, so my deconstruction journey started pretty early because I read the thing. Like, I was,
You actually, unlike what we know from statistics, like,
yeah,
many people in the church aren't actually reading it for themselves.
yeah, like read the whole thing, like cover to
Okay,
cover. And,
okay.
I was maybe 15 or 16 where I started being like, this thing doesn't work the way people are talking like it works. But at the same time, like, I'm not super rebellious by nature, and the churches I grew up in were great. They were loving, they were generous. I don't have a ton of church baggage, to be honest.
Mhm.
Um, they were really generous-hearted people, trying to be faithful and loving me well. At the same time, while I was an adolescent, it felt like a calling to church, but immediately shelved it because the thing I had not seen was church as something consequential in the world, at least not in the way I understood consequence. You're like an
Okay.
adolescent and you want to do something, big and meaningful. And what I had seen didn't feel big or meaningful through my adolescent eyes. So anyway, I had this kind of in like 16, 17 years old. Definitely not sure what I think about the faith I was handed, but at the same time, I feel a calling to the church and I'm not sure I want to follow it. So I go off to college and during my college years, kind of slowly find myself coming back to that calling more genuinely, do church internships, and then spent 13 years during and after college working at a really large church that it would feel a lot like a Willow Creek kind of church. And I did a
Yeah,
little bit of
so
everything.
what do you mean for somebody who isn't in the church leadership space and doesn't know what Willow Creek is, like,
Yeah.
what would be some, like, defining markers of a church like that?
Yeah. So we were really passionate about evangelism and we were
Yeah.
really passionate about using the Sunday service as an evangelistic space. And so that motivated everything from like production values to topics and the way that we would talk about them. And so Sunday morning is a big auditorium with a band doing pop song covers and a big LED wall and sermon series that are really designed to kind of hook people based on the kinds of entertainment they consume and the questions they're asking in their day-to-day life and kind of trying to draw that back to Jesus.
Can I ask you a quick question? Did you
Yeah.
ever do a sermon series called Desperate Households based off of Desperate Housewives?
I don't remember. We did so many, like, TV
Okay.
series and movie it would not surprise me if we did. I think it's probably before I was preaching, because I would remember it more if I had preached in that series, but
I mean, we did one at some point, and I'm pretty sure that we stole it from somebody, and I wouldn't doubt that we had stole it from your church.
yeah, there was an era where the church I was a part of, had a real kind of prominent presence in the larger sort of church scene that church leaders were looking at. So, like, you're 20 years old and, like, I came into this through music, and so I was leading worship before I began to do more leadership and preaching. And I mean, it's a great gig. Like, let's just say in South Bend, Indiana, there aren't a lot of venues like that. But
Sure.
we got to play with great musicians, and like my heart was in it, although I still had a lot of working out to do when it comes to church and faith. Um, at the same time, I pursued a graduate degree at Notre Dame in theology, and that was a more theologically diverse environment, and that was intentional, and I loved it.
Hmm.
But it only complicated things further for me in terms of my relationship to the world that I grew up in and the way that that world read the Bible and the way that that world thought about church and the way that that world thought about salvation and God and all kinds of things. So it was really enriching, but it was complicating.
Was it like as you're at Notre Dame and you're in a more theologically diverse sort of experience, was it just that like your experience growing up in the church that you were a part of and in churches that you had grown up in, was it just like they had this monolithic sort of narrow view, we've got it figured out? This is the only way to think about it? Or was it that the way that they were talking about it, thinking about it, was it just super off-putting as you began experiencing other views? And
Yeah, I would say more than anything, there were just questions that we weren't asking in the world I
okay.
came from that we were asking in that
Hmm.
graduate program. So some of that has to do with like historical critical readings of scripture, right? So, is it okay to think about how Genesis 1 sounds a lot like a riff on the Babylonian creation myth? And if that's the case, does that also mean it was written centuries after the rest of the Pentateuch, and like, what do you do with that? And not to be afraid of those questions, but also one thing I really loved about my schooling environment there was like genuinely the heart behind these inquiries was like for faith. It was like, hey, this is our text. It wasn't like meant to tear down. It was like, let's just wring this thing out and kick it around and get everything we can out of it in terms of the Bible or the tradition. And so, yeah, there was just a lot of things that we were able to pursue without any kind of. It felt like like I've been in environments where you're allowed to ask questions as long as you still come to the same conclusions. You know,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
almost like we
Yeah.
give lip service to the questions, but you got to come back to home base at the end. Whereas at Notre Dame, I didn't feel that. I felt like, no, we're going to love and trust this text, but to love and trust it means to test it and to push it and to dig into it and to go wherever the evidence takes us in terms of like how we understand the story it's telling and where it came from and what it means for us today. So
Hmm.
that's wonderful. But I remember often walking out of class in such a literal daze that I would get lost on campus and forget that I was trying to walk to my car, you know, because I just was like thinking about the things that we were working out together.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
that was a really, really rich time. But again, I think I also felt that the church world that I had been working in, that for lack of a better word, part of its success, success is a really subjective term there. Part of its success was built on what you might call sort of the simplicity of its views or its underlying theology, right? Like
Yeah.
we didn't really
Yeah.
spend a lot of time going under the hood of our ideas and our theology. We just kind of like assumed that package was set and then spent all of our energy kind of trying to deploy those ideas, you know, like trying to reach people, trying to bring other people in, which is different than like lifting the hood and tinkering around in the engine and seeing what's really in there. Which if
Yeah.
you do that, it's really hard to keep driving, you know?
I like that metaphor a lot. And that's as you're saying that, I'm thinking of a lot of conversations that I've been in with church leaders where like they use the cliche phrase that gets used is the message doesn't change, but the methods do.
Yes.
And so we're just trying to communicate the same message that's always been communicated, but we're just trying to like fit it culturally
Yeah.
for a different group of people. When the reality is like the message that you're communicating, if you're poking under the hood, actually what you're communicating is a different message
Yes.
than has been communicated. And maybe the one that you're communicating was developed in, 500 years ago in
That's right.
Europe.
Yep. Yeah,
But
it's like if you wanna test that theory, just go sample 2nd century, 4th century, 6th century, and I'm not saying everybody has time for that or needs to do that, but when church leaders kinda build their kingdom on that mantra, but
yeah,
perhaps they haven't done that work, I think it's kind of a bummer, you know? Because yeah, like, the message it has evolved and changed. Um, shoot, there was another piece there, but it'll come back to me maybe.
I'm sorry, I
No.
screwed you up. I,
No,
I
you
took you off
didn't.
on a
No, you
tangent.
didn't. No, not at all. No. Um, yeah, I'll come back to it if it comes.
Okay. Okay, so you're a part of this staff at this large church that really is in some ways the pinnacle of what so many evangelical churches were trying to do and to become. It's a very large church. It's hosting conferences. People are kind of looking to you for like, what do we do now? What do we do next? And alongside that, you are having these experiences at Notre Dame that are forcing you to ask bigger other questions, and you're feeling a bit unsettled with what your experiences are. Is that kind of a fair assessment with what you've said so far?
Yeah, for sure. Yep.
Okay.
Another thread in that would have just been, really wrestling with questions of inclusion, on a couple of fronts. Whenever I talk about where I've come from, I wanna be really careful because I love where I came from. I love the
Yeah.
people that I worked with, and I'm really proud of the work that we did, and I really believe in the heart behind the work, of those people. But a couple of things like stood out to me. The church I was a part of was egalitarian in theory, meaning we believed in men and women in leadership, and we didn't believe that there was something biblical or theological that should prevent a woman from any of the leadership roles that a man can enjoy. And yet,
Hmm.
I'd walk into a lead team meeting And the 13 people that were responsible for this big thing, with millions and millions of dollars and thousands of people, 12 of them were white men, and there was one woman. And I just thought something's not lining up there. And then the other big piece was just questions around inclusion for our LGBTQ brothers and sisters. And I think sometimes these churches can become kind of don't ask, don't tell churches,
Mm-hmm.
where they never talk about it, but there are these kind of quiet policies that you're going to bump into if you're an LGBTQ person who wants to keep taking steps into community. So those two questions were also really unsettling for me.
Yeah. Okay. So at some point you decide like, hey, my career path, my vocational path is not to keep doing this sort of same thing. What was stirring in you to begin thinking about planting a different kind of church?
Yeah. So first of all, I, I I have not had many what you might call like charismatic experiences in my life, but I had something like that on a trip to Boston in 2010. That I won't. It's a really long story, but the bottom line is I went to Boston to see some friends, and out of the blue, just had this feeling like this heavy presence like setting on me for 4 days. It wouldn't leave, and there's all these experiences that happened while I was there. And out of nowhere, I had the thought. I was like, "Oh my gosh, I'm going to put a church in Boston."
Hmm.
It ended up not being Boston, but I think what happened there was that whole experience was sort of the thing that helped me begin imagining that my future would involve being a part of a new church in a city somewhere. And then, long story short, what I didn't know is it was going to be my city, South Bend.
Yeah. Um, so as you're beginning to think about planting SBCC, what are some of the things that you were thinking about? Like, oh, this is, as I'm trying to explain this to somebody as to like what's unique about our church, what are some of the ways that you would describe the uniqueness of what you were about to do?
Yeah, maybe the best way to get at that is kind of two layers.
Okay.
One is what became our logo, and the other is what became our mantras.
Yeah, I
They're
wanted to
deep.
ask you about your mantras at some point because what a biblical church has are vision, mission, and values.
That's
So
right, straight from Scripture,
yeah,
mission and
New
values.
Age churches apparently have mantras.
Yeah, yeah. Is it okay to go ahead and get into them here?
Yeah, I would love that. I would
Great.
love that a lot.
Yeah, so, like, you realize, like, "Oh, man, we're gonna do a church, so we should probably figure out, like, what it's gonna be," you know? Um, and I wanted to make sure that we sort of embedded deeply some of these impulses. People, as soon as, like, the word gets out that I'm gonna do this new thing, people are asking what it's gonna be like, and I had the feeling that unless I created language for, some sort of deeper streams that will shape this, we're gonna end up describing it kinda superficially, like,
Okay.
stylistically, like, what's the
Yes.
music gonna be like, or what's the feel of Sunday morning gonna be, and it was really important that we go upstream from those questions, but we needed, like, new images and language for that, new symbols, images, and language. So today, if, like, people see our church, our logo is basically a triangle with a blue line through it. The triangle is really, really deep and important for us. In all of our little early in-home meetings, we would ask the question, like, "Well, what's a church?" And then we would use a couple of symbols. One was the triquetra, which is this sort of Celtic Trinitarian knot that often represents for members of the Christian household this kind of Father, Son, and Spirit, this Trinitarian dynamic. So we talk about the creed, this ancient distillation of the story that we're a part of, right? We believe in God the Father. And if people have grown up in more high church or liturgical traditions, they might have recited these creeds in a liturgy. But we believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ, his Son, and in the Holy Spirit. And so I would just start by saying, like, one thing that's really clear is the church claims to be an inheritor of this tradition.
Mm,
Like, we're not starting from scratch. We're part of a long line, and a really long story that we're entering into. So we talk about that for a while and talk about how I really think like the claims of the creed are really beautiful and revolutionary. This world is given; it's not just here. And that's
yeah.
beautiful, right? I mean,
Yes.
everything's a sacrament. That's beautiful, right? This is a story that says that God and human nature are wed to one another, are married in the incarnation, and that in the incarnation God suffers with us, which I think is really profound and important. The Holy Spirit, the idea that like God is actually quite invested in who we are becoming,
Hmm.
right? I mean,
Hmm.
that's really beautiful, right? Like especially
Yes.
when you run up against what you've not become and you're defeated by that. Like, what a beautiful gift. So we talk about that. We inherit the story. And then I'd say, but that's not the only thing going on, right? Because the other symbol I would use is also a triangle, but it's a Greek delta. And the delta, like in math equations, is a symbol for change in a variable. So then we'd say, hey, alongside all this, let's just acknowledge we have this rapidly changing world. And I'm not just talking about, change in style or fashion, or I'm talking like the big structural things that shape human consciousness. And I'm borrowing from people like Phyllis Tickle and others, Kevin Kelly and technology and spirituality. But like we're living through a time of incredible change and disruption, right? And the internet is a baby and social media is an infant. And yet they're already radically rewiring the entire way that our world works and the ways that we think. We're facing we're still integrating the insight that like maybe evolution is how the species got here, at least in a physical sense. And
Yeah.
like, what do you do with that? And does that marry with Christian faith or not? We're dealing with radically shifting ideas about sexuality. We're dealing with the fact that up until very, very recently, most people could spend their entire life in a really, really small ideological ghetto. So, like, if you grew up Baptist, you could spend your entire life not just hearing from Christians. You could spend your entire life really just hearing from Baptists about who God is and what the Bible means and all this stuff, right? You go
Yeah.
from that to this era where I know I have friends who have like 10 and 12-year-olds who are like bumping into lectures from Buddhists online or, like through YouTube. And so this collision of worldviews and cultures is highly disruptive. And so there's you can't I think you can't argue that there's a lot of change happening. There's clearly a lot of change happening. And then we would take those two triangles, the triquetra representing this kind of rooted faith, this story that we've inherited, and the delta representing all the change that we're living through. And we'd put them side by side on the screen. If I was like in a home meeting, I'd put them on the screen or whatever. And we would just ask, okay, so like, what's the relationship between these two things in the church? And I would argue one thing churches can do is say that this rooted faith stuff that we represent with the triquetra, like that's our business. And the changing world stuff, that's just a distraction,
Hmm.
right? So that's one way you can negotiate this. So you just kind of ignore the changing world stuff. Another way you could go is kind of further in that direction. And you could say this rooted faith, this historical faith is our business. And this changing world stuff is more than a distraction. It's actually a threat. And so then, that's when preachers on stages tell people like, don't read these books and don't ask these questions. And it's dangerous out there, right?
Right. Right.
Kind of the bunker mentality. You could go in the opposite direction and you could sort of look at all this change and then look back at the story that we've inherited and kind of hang your head and shrug and say, oh man, that's kind of an unfortunate anachronism. It's kind of out of date. It's kind of embarrassing. It's kind of antiquated. So we'll just kind of like, kind of gently sort of shove that under the rug so we can try to keep up with things. So we kind of put those three possibilities in front of everyone. And then we would look at the book of Acts and the crucible of discernment that the church went through when the Gentiles, these total outsiders, these people who are ethnically and religiously and morally like outside the people of God, the Spirit keeps showing up in them. And then back at headquarters, the church has to decide what to do with it. And the argument we would make is that those three things I just described before, those three ways of relating, we would say South Bend City Church isn't going to be any of those things. We're going to try to be a church that lives in the tension between these two. Like we're going to turn up the volume on both of them. And we're going to live in the tension and we're going to discern together and we're going to ask questions together. And so anyway, so that's why the triangle's in our logo. Like I hope people forever who are part of South Bend City Church remember and know that like we're here to do the messy work of asking questions and discerning, and we're not trying to give up on either end of that spectrum. We're trying to kind of live in the tension of both. That was a long answer, but that was the first part of us saying, what would this be?
No, I love that so much. I remember the first time I went out to visit your church, I stole one of the mugs from your church. You had them
Yeah.
back there for visitors, and so I pocketed one while I was there, and it had the logo on it. And I was just kind of looking at it, and I was like, "Huh, what's going on here with this?" And you sent me this long email like describing it, and it was so like moving. At like even as you describe that now, like there's something so exciting to me about the energy that's created of trying to hold on to
Mm,
both of those things at the same time. And and even like, we could parse out, as you described, the different postures of like, oh, there's fundamentalism and there's like extreme mainline liberalism or whatever, and in those sorts of things. But I think that there's something really beautiful about this, like, hey, we're not going to try and define ourselves in these ways where we're moving towards one at the exclusion of the other. There's some sort of energy that's created in that tension that you're describing that's really interesting.
That's a really good way to say it. There's an energy in the tension. There's actually a liveliness
Yeah.
in the tension. Yeah, it's messy, but it feels really vibrant.
Yeah. Yeah, and I like, as I have gotten to witness you, like, wrestle through different things over the last few years, I find you continually going back to, like, that tension, and there isn't a clean answer for, like, what things look like in that all the time, but it's the commitment to, like, I'm gonna hold these 2 together, and it feels to me like you are trying to hold tension not just there, but in multiple different kinds of areas. And to me, one of the beautiful things I see happening in your church and through your leadership is the commitment to constantly moving towards that tension,
Hmm.
and in ways that are really challenging to me and really interesting and exciting.
Oh, thanks for that. Yeah, and there's definitely days when I'm like, oh man, there's a reason it's tempting to shy away from this.
Yeah.
Because yeah, it's you can't really it it won't let you be lazy, that's for sure.
Hmm.
Um, and I think as a pastor, I've also had to wrestle then with what we've set loose.
Okay.
Um, I
What?
think
Yeah.
one of
What
the
do you mean by that?
I think one of the temptations for pastors is to think that they're responsible for the outcomes and the lives of the people they serve,
Hmm.
individually and as a community, as a church, you know? Um, I don't believe that at all, and yet I believe it all the time, right? Like I if you asked me, "Jay, are you responsible for the outcomes and the lives of the people you serve?" I'd say, "No, that's above my pay grade, and, I had my part to play, but people make their own choices, and by the way, they don't report to me, they report to God," like all that stuff, right? But in practice, when things get messy, yeah, it's I have to check myself and remind myself of my convictions about that, you know?
Hmm. So, are
What
you meaning by that, like, if there was a wave of divorces happening in your church, would you'd start being like, is the way that we're teaching, is the way we're approaching faith, creating a context where a whole bunch of people are getting divorced?
Absolutely. And in
Yeah.
in our case, we've had a few divorces that have come from one member of the marriage. Not until they found a safe space at South Bend City Church were they able to come to terms with the fact that they were actually gay or lesbian and that's just incredibly disruptive, right?
Yeah.
And
Right. Yeah.
yet the status quo was one where, um and I'm not even beginning to prescribe how a couple should navigate that here on this conversation, but I'm just saying the realizing, the awareness, the naming the truth about themselves has been highly disruptive. And you're like, "Oh, man," and they're writing me notes telling me thank you.
Hmm.
And I'm like, "Wait, right? Thank you for the disruption."
Yeah. So, would it be fair to say that, like, one of the things you're trying to do in the church is not that, like, in one church experience, you might have the pastoral advice is you can't even consider divorce, and we need to figure out how to make this marriage work, and you need to stuff those things, and we need to do that. And at another extreme, it might be follow your bliss
Yeah,
and just go do that thing, and because that's true to who you are, and and you're not approaching things like this out of a pre-prescribed sort of answer, but
that's right.
instead, like, let's enter into this relationship in this situation and discern together.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Yeah. Neither of those extremes feels right to me. And also, like, having never lived through what they're living through, I
Mhm.
feel like there'd be a certain kind of hubris in prescribing from where I sit,
Hmm.
what is obviously the right thing for them because 'cause I've never lived in that, but that's one example. Another example would be, so we have a little, one of our taglines is South Bend City Church, a great place to lose your faith.
Yeah, I
And,
had that written down to ask you about too, so I'm glad you're getting into this.
so, I really mean that on 2 fronts. What I don't mean is we're not rooting for people to lose faith. But we dreamed from the very beginning about whether South Bend City Church could be the kind of church where if you happen to go through a loss of faith or an evolution of faith, which a lot of people go through, like, what if you didn't have to hide that? Or what if that didn't make you feel like you were no longer, a beloved member of the community or a safe member of the community? What if we said out loud, that's actually part of being human? A lot of us go through that. You might even go through it
Hmm.
more than once. You might get stuck there. I don't know. But so first of all, we mean, hey, if that's part of the experience of a lot of people, what if this was the kind of church that didn't like shame you or, demand that you repent when you can no longer hold on to those ideas? What if this was the kind of church that said, "Hey, we see you, we get it, we're with you, we love you," you know? And then secondly, it's the belief that there are certain forms of faith that do need to be left behind.
Hmm.
Right? I mean, there is faith that is laced with racism that needs to be left behind. There's faith
Yeah.
that is raised with misogyny that needs to be left behind. There is race that is just, or sorry, faith that is just a cover for perpetuating power structures that are harmful that needs to be left behind. We go on and on and on. So certain, yeah, like there's some kind of faith that should be lost, and then there's other kind of faith that's good and beautiful, but people want to hold on to it, but perhaps it slips through their fingers. And we want to be the kind of community that's with you either way. So when I was talking before about like as a pastor wrestling with what I'm responsible for, like another thing we hear not infrequently is that it wasn't until people became a part of our community that they gave themselves permission to ask some of the questions that have been lurking at the periphery of their life for a long time. And once they allowed those questions to enter, again, it was really disruptive. And um, I guess I just think that like pastoring needs to be really comfortable with disruptions. And I think I need to resign from the job of sort of keeping things nailed down for everyone.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really good, and is a really beautiful thing happening, like in your church. So I was just reading these statistics the other day for some stuff that I was working on, and it said that in the United States, if you're growing up evangelical, by the time that you reach adulthood, 8% of the entire US population has either left for another faith or has left their faith completely.
Wow.
So that equates out to somewhere around 25 million adults in the United States that have
Wow.
grown up evangelical, that have left for another faith tradition or have completely left the faith.
Hmm.
And and so to have a kind of church that says like this is a safe space for that to happen to you, and you don't have to abandon community. You don't have to abandon the whole Jesus story. You don't have to abandon these rhythms. You don't have to abandon a safe space to ask hard questions. Like you don't have to give all that up. There's this space for you like that. To me, just like even like zooming out for a second and thinking about the larger sort of like Christian landscape across the US right now, like that's a really compelling sort of experience, I think,
Mm.
for what is becoming more and more and more reality in our current cultural context.
Yeah, that's that's really helpful to hear you say that actually. Um, and like I think another way I think of it is like if the church essentially is Jesus's table,
Hmm.
Jesus just doesn't seem that concerned about controlling the behavior of the people at his table or filtering the people at his table. He doesn't seem concerned that feeding Judas and pouring wine for him is simply going to further empower Judas's rebellion. You're right. He just,
Yeah. Yeah, that messes me up every time.
yeah, right. So I guess I'm like, hey, if Jesus can be so irresponsible, then so then so can we. In fact, so should we, right?
Man, stop trying to be like Jesus. Let's
We'll get a long way to go.
yeah. Okay, so back to your church. You had this delta that kind of described this experience. I don't know if you want to talk about, you also said that you have a blue line running through that
Yeah,
that,
that's
that
just
feels important to your story.
very much. Yeah. So if you look at a map of the city of South Bend, by the way, South Bend is called South Bend because it's at the south bend of the St. Joe River.
Hmm.
It's that creative. Anyway, if you look at a map of the city, like downtown, the river cuts through downtown at like the same angle as the blue line on our logo. So the blue line's just it calls us local. It's a little sort of symbolic representation of our context.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that's another big piece for us. Because we think that love is particular, we
Mhm.
and we have this collective calling to love our city. And so sometimes we tell the little parable of a child who climbs up in her mother's arms and says, "Mom, do you love me?" And then the mother breaks eye contact with the child, looks out upon the world and says, "I love all my children." Like, that
Hmm.
would be both true and a total failure, right? A total failure
Yeah.
of love.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so similarly as a church, we've just from the beginning, we've also said, imagine one of the tests that we run on ourselves is, like, Mike, if you'd never been to South Bend City Church and I, like, flew to California, kidnapped you, put you on an airplane, didn't tell you where we were going, and somehow got you all the way into a Sunday morning gathering at South Bend City Church without you ever seeing the name on the door or, like, any other hint. Like, is the way that we gather and the way that we pray and the way that we teach and any other slice of our life as a church, is it obvious that this church is here to love and serve South Bend, Indiana? And so that's the other reason it's so important. It's in the logo. We're not trying to just be like another iteration of some national church trend that you could kind of pick up and put anywhere. We're trying to be deeply here because we want to love in a particular kind of way.
Yes. I mean, I like that so much. And not to continually go back to previous experiences, but one of the things that I've been saying to church leaders over the past couple of years is like, hey, there's like 5 churches that influence what the majority of churches do. And I can step into your church and be there for an hour with you and tell you which of those churches,
Yeah.
because like, I mean, it's just the reality of what's happening in sort of the church leadership space right now is that there's these just a handful of dominant sort of like of church expressions in the evangelical experience, and your church is largely being influenced by one of those. And so we're losing the sort of like not just local flavor, but the fact of like being incarnationally indigenous to the community that you are a part of.
Yes.
And being from California, one of the things that started to actually concern me a few years ago was that in the movement of churches that I've been a part of, we were heavily influenced by the South and by the Midwest. And I was like, we are in one of the cultural epicenters of the United States. And the
Right.
thing that's driving the way that we think about and do church
Careful
is
now.
from the South and the Midwest, which
Okay.
I love. I love it over there. I mean, I I couldn't find South Bend on a map. I am a California snob, and I fully embrace that. And well, the first time I was out with you, we were going into you said, "Hey, we're gonna go over to Michigan today." And I was like, "What? Like, what? Oh my gosh, we're going to Michigan?" And you're like, "Yeah, it's like 25 minutes over there." Like, I have no idea where we are. And then you told me last time I was out there, you're like, "Yeah, I'm thinking about going to Kentucky next week." And I was like, "Kentucky?" And you're like, "You know that Kentucky touches our state." And I was like, "No, I genuinely have no idea." Because like, it is true, like, California, like, just sees a blob in the middle, and that's we get no geographical,
Yeah, we
education.
know. We know.
So, all of the stereotypes are 100% true, and all of that to say that maybe the better way of saying it is that there were other places that were not our place that had a stronger impulse to drive the kind of culture we were creating in our church than what our place was actually like.
Yeah, and to be sympathetic toward how that happens, I think there's a lot of reasons it happens, but some of the reasons it happens is, first of all, uh, some of that stuff that everybody's imitating, it's really good.
It is.
I'm a sucker for a Hillsong anthem, man. Like, I really am. It moves me. There's that piece. Also, I think, especially like for churches that are kind of just getting started. I mean, having been through this now a little bit, I realize like if you're trying to create something from scratch and you got to raise funds for it and you got to find other people who are resonant with it, the shortcut is to just point at one of those things you're talking about. It's going to be like
Mm,
that. And people already know what you're talking about. They don't have to imagine it. You don't have to describe it. Like, you don't have to create any new language. And creating language and cultivating a new imagination, that's hard work.
yeah.
And instead, you could just point at that thing and be like, we're going to be like a local version of that. And I think there's a lot of pressure on church leaders to look and feel successful in one way or another, depending on how you define that.
Yeah.
And I mean, I certainly would hope that the people who want to pastor and shepherd people are growing out of that temptation. But I know the pressure is there, right? And some of it is really because you want to make a difference. Some of it's kind of altruistic and noble. You want this mission to matter. You want to reach people, and then some of it's probably ego and all that other messy stuff. So I guess I'm not unsympathetic to how that happens, but man, I agree with you. I think it's tragic. I think it's the opposite of what we need right now.
Yeah. You're so good for me. You're the there you are going for the tension again.
Uh,
And like, hey, we're not going to throw it out. We're going to find the good and we're going to hold on to that while we're also going to move towards this other thing. Um, so you've got that logo, and then you've also got these mantras
yes.
that describe kind of your community. So tell us a bit about the mantras and what those mean and why they're important to you.
Yeah. We, like any community, wanted to flesh out a little bit more who we were and what we would do and how we would do it. Um, I've been in many organizations that have values. They put them on the wall, and I'm not trying to be cynical, but they just don't mean much. And
Hmm.
especially like I think the real test of a value is when has it cost you something? Just that. If you can't tell me when that value has cost you something, then it's not it doesn't matter. It might be a value, but not in any way that matters.
Yeah, yeah,
So I didn't want like something vague and generic on the wall, like we value. I don't know. I don't want to go any further because I'm going to start naming examples.
yeah, yeah. Don't. That's good. You're good.
But we did need something to further flesh out from the very beginning. So from the very beginning, we began using these mantras, and the reason we call them mantras is because we're excessively trying to be new age and hip. No, I'm just kidding. No, no. We call them mantras because a mantra is a portable prayer that you take with you, and you repeat it to yourself on a regular basis for its transformative power in your life. That's
Oh, I
why they're
like
mantras.
that.
Yeah, and so we wanted mantras that would both be the shaping values of our church community and that we would take with us into our everyday life so that there would be sort of an alignment there. So we have three mantras that I kind of tend to think now as they kind of orbit the fourth, and the fourth is sort of the maybe heartbeat at the middle of everything.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, the three that kind of orbit the fourth are fields, not factories, sushi, not fish stew, and practices, not performances. Fields, not factories is about recovering an ecological imagination. And we mean that whether it's for our church or for like our personal lives, it's just the idea that an industrial imagination has a way of creeping into everything in the last, I don't know, a couple hundred years. We tend to think that everything works the way a factory works. And I'm all for factories because they're really good at making widgets. I just don't think the human heart is a widget. And I don't think that
Hmm.
the community, that churches are widgets or widget factories. And so the difference between fields and factories is many, but like in fields, it's often about patience. In factories, it's often about efficiency. In fields have seasons and factories don't. And so, as far as I know, the best factories are ones that produce output all the time. And yet the best fields, the ones that make the most vital life, often have seasons of fallow and have winters. And so we try to reclaim sort of seasonality in who we're becoming. So fields not there's a lot there. I could preach the whole sermon on each of these, but fields not factories.
Yeah, yeah.
Sushi, not fish stew. This is about intentional simplicity. The question I always ask is like, if you went to a great restaurant and the chef said, "Man, I have just got some beautiful salmon. It's in season and it's fresh caught and the specimen is gorgeous, and I just can't wait for you to taste this." And they went back in the kitchen and they banged around for a while, and then they came out and they put like a big pot of fish stew in front of you, and you'd be like, "Wait, where's the fish? Where's the salmon? Right? Like, why is
Yeah,
it?"
it gets lost.
It gets lost, right? And there's a documentary called Jiro Dreams of Sushi that was the inspiration for this one.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, and so it's simplicity, but it's not easy simplicity. We're talking about a lot of people, a lot of teachers call out now the simplicity on the other side of complexity,
Yep.
and so you got to work all the way through the complexity to get to the hard won simplicity on the other side. And we mean this in terms of like the way that we gather. We mean it in terms of like our programs. We don't do a lot of programs as a church. Churches, there's just this natural trend that you just add program after program after program. And the church I was working at before this, there was a meeting once where our lead team was contemplating adding, there was something that we were going to launch, like a program. And we were going to tell the church, everybody should do this. This is for everybody at this church. This is like 101. Like, you got to get in on it. And then somebody in the meeting was like, hey, could we do an inventory of all the things that we've told people everybody needs to be doing if you're like a faithful member of this church?
Oh my gosh.
And by the time we added it up, attend a service and then volunteer at a service different than the one that you attend, and then bring your kids to youth group and then attend your own small group in the evening. And then you got to do some of your own like quiet time in your day-to-day life. And then you've got to show up to volunteer downtown at the community center. And before you know it, we had like 18 commitments a week. And that's the case everywhere, right? Like, systems trend toward complexity.
I'm super guilty of that as you're describing that. I was like, yep, I did that.
Yeah, I think we all do, unless we call it out. So anyway, sushi, not fish stew. It's just it's simplicity on many levels: aesthetic, programmatic, theological. But it's the simplicity on the other side of complexity. We got to do all the work to get there. Practices, not performances. I mean, this is just kind of gospel 101, right? Like,
Mm.
you have nothing to prove. You don't have to earn it. And we believe that with God, and we believe that with one another, and we believe that has to be the operating system of our church. And it could be the way that you live your life. And if you have nothing to prove and you don't have to earn it, and nothing is like performance pressure, and it's all practice, it's all a chance to grow and stretch, then it means that failure isn't fatal. In fact, failure can be a gift because you learn from it. And then we've tried to shape our gatherings in a sort of practice mindset too, so that when you come and gather, um, you don't just watch us do the things on stage, right? I remember the church I was working at before, a friend's mom came with him and visited one day. Wonderful woman of deep faith. And at the end of the service, I was preaching that day, and we talked afterwards, and she was really kind and encouraging, but then very gently and innocently, she said, I was wondering like when we would get to pray.
Oh,
And I was like, I'll be honest, I was defensive. I just preached like
yeah.
7 services that weekend. I knew the service order inside and out. And my thought was, lady, what are you talking about? We prayed at the 7-minute mark. And because, we had the service order. I could tell you, I prayed here and there. But I kind of gently said, oh, well, we remember when I prayed then and then. And she said, oh, no, 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 I know you got to pray. I was wondering when we would get to pray.
Hmm.
It just knocked me over. So we bear that in mind a lot in our gatherings. We want our gatherings to not be a performance venue, but a practice lab. And so
Yeah.
just, how do we create moments while we are together where everybody's in on the action, working together through our practices.
Yeah, I mean, I know one of the things you do when it's not COVID era, and you've experimented with ways of doing this during COVID, but is that like you've got open floor times, right?
Yeah,
Where
yeah,
people just get up and share.
yeah. And
And
they scared the crap out of me at first, and they're so good.
yeah, like who knows what like crazy Uncle Joey's gonna say when he gets up and he gets the microphone.
Yeah, and Crazy Uncle Joey is great. At least we know Uncle Joey. It's also like this person none of us on staff have ever met before,
Hmm.
right? Maybe it's their first time there. So yeah, we often do an open floor. There's a prompt, or maybe it's, hey, last week we challenged one another to try this practice. How did it go? Or it's, hey, what comes to mind when you hear this topic that we're going to get into? And overwhelmingly, they are some of the best moments in our gatherings.
Hmm.
I mean, things break open. I just the open floor has single-handedly restored my faith in sort of the Holy Spirit and the priesthood of all believers.
That's really interesting. I was interviewing the president of a Christian college recently for another podcast that I help with, and I was asking him like, hey, what are you concerned with in the church right now, and what does the church need right now? And he said like, I'm continually concerned with the consumeristic mindset in the church. And he said, I think the answer for it is to reintroduce testimonials into the church.
Wow.
And that's just
Yeah.
been because, we have a million conversations all the time about consumerism in the church. Like that's just been in the water
Yeah,
talking
yeah.
about the last 20 years.
Yep.
I'd never heard somebody say the way that you deal with it is by reintroducing testimonials, and the idea of like the empowerment of every person in the church to recognize that God is doing something in their midst, in their life, and that they have something to offer and say and contribute to the larger conversation. And it's not just this trained professional Christian who gets up and can do that.
Yeah, another way I think of it is like, you can't keep treating people like kids and then complain that they're not growing up,
Hmm. Yeah.
right? Like,
Yeah.
you're a parent, I'm sure, like, and it's not, you can't be dumb about it. Like, you're not gonna give your 15-year-old the kind of privileges they might have when they're 22. I get that. Like, it's developmental. But if you treat your 15-year-old like they're 4, they're gonna be arrested in their development, right? Like,
Mm.
and I think we do that in our churches a lot, especially the more concerned we are with sort of producing a kind of flawless performance on Sunday.
Yeah, that's really good. Okay, so you describe, and then there's one more that you said everything's
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so those 3 are kinda how we move, and we take we take them with us into our everyday life too. They're not just for the church. But then the heartbeat at the center of all this is everyone an icon, which is, just based on that opening move in scripture that men and women are bearers of the sacred image of God. And, the scripture gets pretty quick to telling us some of the things that means. Like in Genesis 9, the reason that murder is prohibited is that humanity bears the image of God. It's a desecration against God. It's not just an offense against your brother or your sister. And so for us, then everyone an icon means a bunch of things, but it means people are not projects. It means when somebody new walks into our church, our first move is to recognize that we have been honored with their presence, right?
Hmm.
Because they walk in the unique way that they bear the image of the God that we worship, and so we want to honor that and recognize that's sacred. It's taken us into some challenging conversations around racial justice, around inclusion for LGBTQ people, and other areas. It's had us wrestle with the ways that we other. And then it also calls us really deeply back to Christ because when the scripture says that we bear the image of God, and then the scripture says that Christ bears the image of God, and then the scripture says that we are here to look like Christ and be conformed to Christ, like it's full circle, right? And so, by the way, the scripture never revokes its assessment. The scripture never says humanity used to bear the image of God and now we
Hmm.
don't. It never,
Hmm.
it complicates the assessment because there's other things that are true of us too, but it never
Yeah,
revokes it. So this isn't like I don't care who you are or decisions you've made or the state of your life right now. I still like, if I meet you, my mission, my job is to start with God, show me the way that you are uniquely reflected right now in this person. Um, but then, of course, there's all the ways that we are sort of struggling to live up to that and to grow into that. And so, everyone in Icon also calls us back to Jesus, who I think is quite interested in just in calling us, wooing us, growing us into the full expression of that unique sort of identity that we each carry in the world. So, everyone in Icon becomes, in many ways, kind of the heartbeat for us.
that's so good. And I feel like in my few experiences with your church, I've seen that lived out in so many different ways. And I've told you this my first time that I went out to visit you all. I really thought like this is going to be a church full of a bunch of like 30 something white dudes who are pretty
Mhm.
educated, who sit around drinking whiskey, talking about theology while listening to Bon Iver.
Which that
And
that's just my house in the evenings.
and I was pleasantly, like, really shocked by how diverse your community is
Mm.
socioeconomically, culturally, ethnically, like, and just having conversations with some of the folks there that, like, that they're homeless folks who are part of your community, and they're genuinely not a project, they're genuinely a part of your community. And I remember talking with this one great older African American woman who I know is so integral in your community, and she kind of like saw me and knew that wasn't a part of the church normally, and like just started talking to me, and I just started asking her all these questions, and the way that she appreciated how you as a church have really worked hard to center voices like hers, like there's just something really powerful to me about the experience of I just think the way that you're talking, the way that you're thinking about things, it would have been really easy for you to attract a lot of other people who are most like you. And you
Right.
get in a room with a bunch of people talking about like how woke we are, and talking about like how we need to fight for justice, and we need like, and it's just a bunch of white dudes sitting around talking about these things that, and it's a theoretical idea.
Yes.
And that mantra like forces you to like put it in practice in a way that has to be real in your church, or it's
Mm.
just a value that's on the wall, right?
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, that's really generous. And we also, like in our early, conversations, we talked about being diverse, like the city.
Hmm.
Like, so for me, actually, diversity is not an abstract value. It's it's particularized by our context.
Yeah.
And the core group that we started with was overwhelmingly white and more formally educated than our city, whiter than our city, and more financially prosperous than our city by far.
Okay.
And and at the same time, early on, it was Black and Latinx members of our community in our core group who, when they heard me talk about how we have a goal of being diverse like the city, they are the ones who actually took me aside and said, "We love it. Please stop saying that." I
Hmm.
was like, "Wait, say more." And they educated me on how when like majority white churches try to be diverse, they're like, "We've seen this a million times. You're going to do window dressing. It's going to create an exploitative relationship with this church and the more diverse members of this church in our city." And so our attack has been not to like pursue diversity as a target or a goal, like try to recruit a more diverse room.
Yeah. Yeah.
Our experiment has been, what if you just made sure that you keep trying to understand what it is to be just and equitable and to honor the diversity that's currently here? Um, what if you ask scary questions of your non-white members about what it's really like to be a part of a majority white congregation?
Yeah.
And what if you don't
Yeah.
get defensive? And what if you let them really speak? And what if you put them on a stage and let them tell the truth? And I think what we're learning is like you can actually, surrender the goal of like a target demographic because we are allergic to that as
Yeah.
a community. But if you live up to everyone an icon, and I'm not suggesting we've done that perfectly, but as we keep growing toward living up to that in the spaces that we cultivate together, what I'm discovering is that something else is at work, you know, bringing together a community that's more and more diverse while we just try to make sure we're doing the right thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Absolutely. Um, I like that a lot. I think that it's one of the things I talk to church leaders about sometimes is that I'll draw a line for them, like a straight line with an arrow, and I'll write goal on it. And then
Yeah.
I'll draw a line that kind of like merges off of that, and I'll write outcomes off of it. And I'll
Oh, nice.
and I'll talk to them about like the goal that you go after has certain outcomes, and what the goal is matters. And sometimes we make things that should be natural outcomes the goal, and when
That's
we make things that should be
yes.
the outcomes the goal, we end up with these other kinds of outcomes that we don't want to have. And so,
That's so
like,
good, man.
yeah,
Yeah.
understanding which is really important, and that's kind of what I was hearing you share there. Like, diversity for diversity's sake is not the goal. It's an
Yes.
outcome of of trying to live out the actual calling of the gospel of moving towards justice and equity, and the implications of that, of being incarnational in our city, of living that out, has this sort of like outcome and effect. um, but if we go after that outcome as the goal, then it's just like we're hiring a black guy to be our worship leader, but we aren't actually elevating black voices and shaping who we are as a church. We're just
Yes.
making sure we hit our quota of 20% of the stage is black folks.
Yeah, that's right. And to be clear, we do like proactively seek out like diverse staffing, diverse leadership. So we do like pursue some of that stuff. But to me that's about the goal is being like I don't know how to create a just and equitable community
Hmm.
unless diverse voices are shaping the community. Because I'm always going to
Yeah.
have blind spots, right? So yeah, like and then there's that outcome you're talking about. I think we like one of our rules is it's kind of a private, like an under the hood rule, but it's something we check ourselves on. That any any person who sort of represents um, a minority or a marginalized class or anything like that, whether it's a black woman or a gay man or like you name it, right? That if we're going to put them on our stage, that needs to be backed up by them having genuine and legitimate influence shaping our community behind the scenes. Like,
Yeah.
I don't want any performative diversity that isn't mirrored and corroborated with influence
Yeah.
diversity, on the board or on the staff or even just in my conversations. So I'm not gonna call
Yeah.
you if you're a black member of our church, I'm not gonna call you and say, "Hey, will you, be on stage this week?" if I haven't also called you and said, "Hey, can we get a drink, and can you talk to me about what it's like to be a black member in this church, and what are we missing right now? Like, where have we fumbled?" And I don't wanna use you on our stage unless unless you've been invited into that influence behind the scenes when nobody's looking.
Hmm. That's so good. I could talk to you about your church forever, because I love you and I love South Bend City Church, but I want to zoom out a little bit, because I want to talk about sort of like the bigger thing that's happening within the post evangelical movement, and maybe the way to do it is, when you and I first met a few years ago, we were on an Israel Palestine peacemaking trip, and there's so many things about that that were really impactful. But one of the things that you said to me one day has been a phrase that I've carried with me, and I have repeated it over and over to probably 50 people. As you described your church and described all these things that you're talking about SBCC right now, you said at one point, you said, I feel ecclesiologically homeless.
Mhm.
Um, so, f for folks that don't know, ecclesiology has to do with, like, a theology of the church and what it means to be the church, and even, like, link arms with, like, a larger tribe of like-minded sorta church folks. So when you were saying, "I feel ecclesiologically homeless," like, what were you meaning by that?
Yeah, first of all, I think it comes from an earlier experience of feeling like I had a home.
Yeah.
So, not only the church that I worked at, but in the larger church world, we knew that there was this whole sort of world of other sort of kindred and like-minded communities out there in the world. And we would travel and spend time with them and learn from each other, and we would share resources with each other and best practices with each other. And it was really, it built a great sense of larger belonging. It helped us
Mhm,
remember that God's doing things in other places, and frankly, it made the work easier. Not only was it great in the soul to not be alone, because we don't want to be alone, but in the work it was better too. Um, and in the last couple of years, um, there was a real sense of loss around that. In some ways, it's because of some of the things that we've clarified at South Bend City Church. So, the biggest one by far is that in 2018 we clarified that, um, while you'll find people at South Bend City Church across the whole spectrum on sexuality, you'll find conservatives and progressives and all that. We wanted to clarify our behavior. And so we wanted to make sure that if you identify as L or G or B or T or Q, that you knew that you would be welcome into every stage of belonging and leadership and involvement and marriage at South Bend City Church. And that clarification certainly meant there were invitations that I stopped receiving as a preacher and a pastor, and that's one little piece. It meant that our community, even locally, it's strange. It- it's it's been made kind of clear that like there's other communities that perhaps see us as a threat because of that.
mhm.
That we are sort of a corrupting influence, and so even like we have nonprofit partners who have to be careful about their involvement with us because their support base comes from a lot of more traditionally conservative churches, and if those churches, find out that we're also involved, it puts their relationship with those churches at jeopardy. So there's all these ways that we're just sort of reminded that like we are a little more alone now. And then it comes down to the really practical stuff, like whether we're looking for kids curriculum. And I remember a couple of years ago. Now, fortunately, we found some really good stuff, but a couple of years ago, like we were just flabbergasted that we kept looking for kids curriculum that like in the images had anything besides white faces, and there was a while where we
Hmm.
couldn't find any,
Yeah, yeah.
you know, or we're like even things like staffing, like networks are really important for finding great team members. And so uh, in the world I came from, there was a large, robust, really fantastic network that you could easily tap into when you needed to find great staff who had professional expertise in the areas that you needed. And now we're kind of out here in this space where it's a lot harder to do that because it's not clear where the networks are. So everything from the level of like relationship and personal belonging all the way down to like the really tactical stuff about how it is that churches get their job done and
Yeah.
how you're better off if you have sort of a network that you can tap into.
And did you feel like we're the only church doing this? I don't know anybody else who kind of fits kind of us? Were you starting to find other people along the way?
Yeah, the first sense was, "Oh, man, we're kinda out here in the wilderness," and I don't think I ever believed that we were the only ones. That'd be a kinda hubris I hope I was never guilty of. But I knew that I didn't know who else was out there,
Hmm.
and so, yeah, so little by little, we started sort of collecting kindred communities, you know? I was on our mutual friend Luke's podcast, at the very beginning, and because of that, found some friends in Belfast at a really beautiful church, and we've stayed close since. And you've been a huge part of us finding kindred communities that we can learn from and sort of derive some mutual support. Um, and every week or two now, and I know you have the similar situation. I hear from somebody else who either they're on a personal journey that looks a little bit like Sapin City Church, or their community's on a journey that looks a little bit like ours. And I think we all agree we want to be there for each other.
Yeah. Yeah, so you and I have been connecting with a handful of folks who kind of fit in the space and are leading churches in the space, and then yeah, we're getting messages on the regular. I just had a phone call yesterday with somebody um who fit in the space and said, and I used your phrase like, "Hey, my friend describes it this way, feels ecclesiologically homeless." And he's like, "That's exactly it." Had a phone call on
Mm,
Monday with another guy who had gotten my name from somebody else who said like, "Hey, I heard that like you're kind of operating in this space and I've been doing this church and just kind of feel like all alone and wondering like, are there other people out there?" Um, so what is it as you've been connecting with other church leaders who kind of are doing something similar-ish to what you're doing, or have maybe doing similar things is the wrong way of saying it, but have like a similar heartbeat, you have kind of like a resonance in some sort of way. What do you see happening, maybe in like the broader church in the US and even specifically around the post evangelical kind of movement? Is that too broad of a
yeah.
question?
Well, you can tell me based on my answer
Okay.
whether I heard what you were asking. Well, I mean, first of all, I think institutions and structures are always lagging indicators of movements.
Hmm.
So, like a movement can be kind of a raw, unfunded thing. It just, it can just emerge from people's experiences and desires. And, I would um, be so bold even to like use the language of like what the spirit is doing.
Mhm.
And then I'm not anti-institution. I think institutions are vital and we need healthy institutions, and institutions and structures and systems and all that stuff is just meant at its best, I think, to lend a little bit of structure and longevity to things that are sort of young and perhaps a little bit insecure. And so I think what's happening right now is, Rob Bell did a podcast a while ago called Hymn for the Curve.
Yep, yep.
And I have listened to that episode so many times. And he just talks about like sometimes the thing that you're called to do, it's not in the center of the dominant consciousness. It's not where a lot of people are. Doesn't mean you're better or worse than them or vice versa. It's just the thing that you're called to do is like on the tail end of that little bell curve, you know. And when you're in that tail end, that front end of the curve, it can be a little lonely. You might have to
Mhm.
draw your inspiration from other sources. But the reason I bring it up today is actually like I actually think the curve is coming. And one of the reasons I think that is there's the people who individually as leaders and representing their communities are saying very clearly like, hey, the evangelical thing, whether its view of scripture or its relationship to Christian history, which is to say it doesn't really have a relationship with Christian history, um or its politics or whatever, that leaders and churches that are overtly saying not all of that's quite right for how we understand God. And but then there's this whole other crop of leaders in particular, leaders, and then just people who are maybe not be leaders in church, but just everyday people who are like, maybe they can only say it privately right now, right? Maybe, they can't admit that they can't say publicly that, half of the lead team at the church they're a part of is in a far more inclusive space in terms of their own convictions around sexuality. But the bigger thing doesn't want to move there. It's afraid of moving there. So um, I guess what I'm trying to say is like, and I'm not suggesting, oh man, in 10 years everybody's going to agree with us or whatever. I think that's really dumb. But I think there's a groundswell coming. Um, I think there's a lot bubbling up right now, and I think we're in a kind of an exciting time. And I think the question right now is just for places where it's already sort of becoming overt and explicit. How do we support one another and call each other to the best version of that, to the most faithful version of that, and just sort of add a little bit of structure and support to one another in the work so that we can do it with longevity and for the long haul. And um, yeah, I guess I'm excited, and I think right now there's a lot of work to be done on helping us find one another and learn from each other.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that too. When I was out with your church a year ago, was at lunch with your staff, and I remember one of your staff members asked me, like, "Hey, do you see, like in the broader church landscape, do you see more and more churches like ours on the rise?" And at that moment, I was like, I am really hopeful that there will be, but I'm not seeing a lot of movement in that. In
Mhm.
fact, I'm seeing the opposite. I'm seeing like the rapid growth of mega churches, that we have more mega churches than we've ever had before. And in addition to that, a higher percentage of people that go to church go to mega churches. So now over 50% of people who attend church on a weekend go to a mega church. So
Wow.
you're seeing this movement in that direction. And but at the same time, the other thing we're seeing happen is a rapid, and it's rapidly increasing decline of people who are attending church in America. Um, and so we have this movement towards the megachurch and more megachurches. All the while, the amount of people who are actually engaging in church is significantly decreasing, and it's not keeping up at all. And then in the evangelical model, we're seeing it get older and older. The latest stat shows that the average age in an evangelical church is 55 years old.
Wow.
And if you're over 65, you are 26% of our population is likely to be consider themselves an evangelical if you're over 65. If you're between 18 and 30, it's only 8%.
Hmm.
So it's this like super significant loss. And so along with that, with those sorts of like larger trends that are happening, one of the things that I've been finding is this like movement of churches like yours that I think I just wasn't aware of at that time in the same sort of way. And it was kind of like, I forgot what the effect is called, but it's like when you get a car and you never saw anybody with that same car, that same color
Yes.
before, and now you see
And
it
now you see them
everywhere.
everywhere? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I feel like over the past year, like it's just everywhere. And whether it's from like random people who somehow get my name and email or phone number and are reaching out, or whether it's people that I'm discovering through other friends or people that like I'm just somehow finding that it's like, oh, there's a lot more happening here. And some of it's even like you're describing within churches where I'll go in to do some work there, whether it's to speak or do some consulting or something. And I'll have a staff member who is like followed me online or something, and they'll pull me aside and they'll be like, hey, can we get some coffee later? And you
It's
just
like
find like
Nicodemus coming to Jesus at night.
that's exactly what it is. And and they're all trying to figure out like, are there churches where I could be fully myself and be on staff at them? Are there spaces for me? And so, I feel like I've given South Bend City Church at least 50 podcast listeners probably for your sermons. And I feel like
Which
if
is
they're
why we have 51 listeners. That's awesome.
well, I was just gonna say, like, I feel like if they're tithing, like I get some sort of finder's fee out of that.
We'll work on that.
Isn't that how the model works?
Totally.
Um, anyways, all that to say, that long, like, kinda little rant to say, like, I do think that you're right. I think that there is this swell of movement that's happening there that gives me a lot of hope,
Mm.
um, for the future landscape of the church. And I'm not like, I have a lot of appreciation for the megachurch model.
Yeah, yeah.
It's been really good to me. There are a lot of people who are really good to me in it, and I have a lot of good friends that are leading in it, and there's a lot of churches that I get to interact with and help and be a part, like that, like that's what they feel called to. And I think that they're doing really, really good work, and there's been some really good things that have come of it. And at the same time, there's this other sort of church like yours that's emerging, that's that's new and different. It feels like it's like taking some steps forward into a new space that makes me really hopeful for the church
Mm.
at large.
Oh, that's beautiful, man. That makes sense. I should say too, and I don't know why I feel the need to clarify this. It's not really a response to what you said, but it brought it up in me.
Yeah.
And the thing is just like I'm not one of these people who frets about like the survival of the church.
Hmm.
Uh, I, I don't know. I just like I get that sometimes, especially among like sort of quote unquote people in the missional space. I guess I'm like God is always working and moving, and I think rather than like movements serving the preservation of the church, I think we need churches that serve the movement of God.
Hmm.
And you know, another little piece in my story was right before we launched Stop in City Church. I had this group of really close friends, and we're still really close, and we still meet every 2 weeks. Have been for years. Not right now with COVID spiking, but all these friends. The Every guy around that table, like I realized, it's precisely because they're thinking and engaging and asking questions and living their real life. It's for all those very reasons that they've had to leave church behind. And so then what's happening is they've left that behind, but they don't have any other sort of obvious way to access the best resources in this tradition.
Yeah.
And I think a church can be like a shelter within which to access the very best resources of our tradition, so that we can grow in love and know God and discover that we have in fact been given the things that we need in this tradition. But if you really believe in an idea, some people who like the way that you're going to serve the idea that you believe in is you're going to give a TED talk. That's awesome. I love TED talks. But I think, frankly, if you really believe in an idea, if you think it serves the world, then the bravest and most important thing you could do possibly would be to build a community or an institution around that idea, because
Hmm.
it's communities and institutions that actually preserve and give away these ideas. So I'm not like an institutionalist. Like I think, the church can happen with 3 or 4 people around a table without a 501(c)(3) or a brand. But I also think we need the kinds of organizations and spaces where anybody can find their way there, and we can share with one another the goods, like the riches. So yeah, this for me is not like an exercise in like, wow, we gotta like, keep the church updated so it doesn't become obsolete, and so we get
Yeah.
the young kids. I don't really care at all. But I do think
Yeah.
the world is really well served when the way of Jesus is embodied communally and collectively.
Yeah, I think that's good, and that's a helpful corrective too of like even the way that we think about those statistics, um, not as a like, oh, we've got to correct all these things, but more as like a dashboard indicator of like, huh,
Yeah. Yep.
something like maybe we're missing something right
Yes.
now.
Yeah.
And I like I like I like the way that you frame that. Is really helpful. Um, well, I had told you that we would talk for like 20 minutes or something, and
And I
we've
warned you, I doubted it.
I I love talking to you. I could talk to you forever about this stuff, but I think this has been really, really helpful. I'm really glad to get to expose some more people to the work that South Bend City Church is doing. In fact, um, do you want to can we plug like your podcast or your website, like where to find you
Yeah,
all
sure.
at?
Yeah, we're South Bend City Church, southandcitychurch.com. We are SB City Church on Facebook and Instagram. South Bend City Church on podcast. We do video teachings you can find on Instagram or on our webpage. Um, yeah, so we're out there, and if anything we have is useful, we're happy to give it away and hope that it serves somebody else someplace else too.
No.
One more note, I'll just say, I think this perspective is really important. I jokingly call you the bishop. It's not actually a joke. I actually mean it, and what I mean by that is, I know me personally in South Bend City Church, like we benefit from having a friend and a partner who's actually from the outside. You're both inside outside. I mean, you know us. You've been here. You've been on the inside with us, but you also have a perspective that's different from the one that we have here in the trenches in South Bend. And man, I hope your listeners can appreciate and understand the part that you're playing in this for a whole bunch of us right now, because it is a little disorienting when you get sort of tunnel vision in your context. And I've never been a lead pastor before, and you've got a season of experience in that role that I get to draw on all the time. And then just the fact that you're kind of, if my job is 30,000 feet at South Bend City Church, sort of as primary leader for vision, I feel like you get to be at like 50,000 feet.
Hmm.
You're almost at like satellite view, kind of taking in a whole continent at a time. And then already in our short history as friends and partners in this, teammates and I have benefited from just kind of like throwing up a question to you, and you're able to kind of look elsewhere and kind of pull in or pull together. And we have just felt in spades the way that really helps. So, Mike, I'm so grateful for you, man. And
Yeah.
this is really fun to get to talk. But I feel like I've been doing all the talking here, but I hope your team knows how often your team, your listeners, your crew, whoever that is, I hope they know how often the conversation goes the other way, and I'm just trying to get everything I can out of you and how much it helps us.
That's really kind of you. I appreciate that. And it's a good note to end on. When I interviewed David Gushee about his book on post evangelicalism, he said at the end of the interview, he goes, "This is the most thorough conversation I've had on this book." And I was like, "That's going on my Twitter bio." Uh, so now I like ending it on the spot where people say like, "You're pretty awesome," and I'm like, "That's where we're going to end our interview."
Hey,
So,
Mike,
yeah,
you're pretty awesome.
I mean that does feel like a good place to end it, doesn't it? Man, so much good stuff, wasn't there? I'm so glad to get to introduce you all to Jason, and definitely at some point need to have him on again to unpack more things and more ideas. We're just getting to like start to scratch the surface of what he's doing and the kinds of things that South Bend City Church is doing, and I just love what's happening there. And as I mentioned at the beginning, that I've been giving more and more of my time and energy and focus towards trying to help the Post Evangelical Church. You heard that sort of need there of feeling ecclesiologically homeless and all the implications that has. And at the same time that there's this like growing groundswell movement that's happening there. And so I've felt called in this next season to give some of my time, to give an increasing amount of my time to this, to try and see if I can help create connection in that space, to try and see if I can help build some of the resources alongside others and help churches building these needed resources, and to try and see if I can help like catalyze some of what's happening there, if that could be a part of what I do in this next season. And so as I've been doing that, it's become really apparent that it's going to actually take a couple of years to build something there that's going to be able to be self-sufficient and self-funding. And so one of the things that I'm doing is I'm working on raising half of my salary and expenses for the next 2 years to be able to give my time more and more in that direction. And I would love it if you would consider that, if the work that I'm doing, that you're like, I just believe in you. I've had several people come alongside me saying like, hey, I wanna help you in this season. And what does that look like? Or if you're like, I think that something is happening here. I think like maybe the Spirit actually is doing something here, and I want to see where that goes, and I want to make sure that we're doing the best that we can to enable these kinds of churches to thrive, and more of them to be birthed, and for something really special to be able to happen there. And if that's something that you'd want to help with, I'm not looking to like try and be somebody that raises funding for my salary forever that you would give ongoing forever and ever and ever. What I'm kind of looking to do is I've been saying it like this to people, that think about this as startup funds, that you won't see a monetary return on your investment, but instead you're going to be a part of helping to connect and resource and catalyze a post-evangelical movement. And if that's something that like maybe stirs in you in some sort of way, or you want to be a part of, I would love to connect with you. And so maybe there's like two things that I'd put out there. The first is like, feel free to shoot me an email. My email is mike@mikegoldsworthy.com, and I'd love to find a time to connect, if you're local, socially distant in the backyard, or to get on a phone call, or to like get on a Zoom and chat. Or if you're like, just, hey, like, can I just send you a little something? Like, I've got a 501c3 that's going to receive funds for the next 2 years, so you can get tax deductible donations. and especially as we get towards the end of the year, and as some of you are thinking about that. So that if you're interested in that the checks get made out to, it's called We Ministries, WE Ministries, and you can mail that to me, to Mike Goldsworthy, at 6285 East Spring Street, number 474, and that's in Long Beach, California, 90808. Again, but email me. I'm more than happy to talk to you about it and to provide you with all that information. But I don't feel any pressure at all, friends. Like, I love putting this stuff out. I love putting these resources in your hands. Don't feel like I'm asking you to like pay for this or any sort of thing. I simply want to put out there that this is sort of the reality of where my energy and effort and focus is going, some of the things that I feel called to in this next season. And I just want to invite you to be a part of that if that's something that you'd like to be a part of. And if not, no worries at all. Anyways, I hope that you enjoyed this interview, that you're inspired by some of the things Jason's doing. I hope that you'll pay attention to his church and what's happening there. And I'm excited for our next few episodes where we will hear a few other maybe like vantage points of what's happening in this post-evangelical space. And until then, grace and peace to you, my friends.